Hello and welcome back, future scientists. I've got another great lesson ready for y'all today. We'll go ahead and get started to make the most out of our time together. So we're kind of leaving all the macromolecule stuff away for now, and we're talking about something a little bit different. We're talking about the scientific method. When I see y'all next time, we're going to do a lab on enzymes. And anytime you're doing a lab, it's important to know some of the scientific principles that go into it. Your teacher might have you identify different parts of the scientific method when you're doing your lab, so you just want to be familiar with these terms. We'll come back to the scientific method plenty of times over the years, over this year, but I just wanted to introduce it today before we did our lab together next time. So what is the scientific method? Well, this is really steps to solving a problem. And although it's called the scientific method, you tend to do this every day. We just kind of give them special names and kind of go into the background on them a little bit more, okay? So what are these steps of the scientific method? Well, first of all, you want to identify a problem. And you do this as you're going through your life. You're walking around, you see something that maybe isn't working the way it's supposed to, or maybe could work a little bit better. So we're always identifying a problem somewhere. Okay, that's the first step of the scientific method. What's the next step? The next step is that you want to collect information and do research. So once you've established what the problem is, you want to do a little bit of independent research. See if you can figure out why this thing is acting or not acting the way that it's supposed to. Okay, you want to obtain facts and ideas from books, do some research online, anything like that is collecting information. The next part of the scientific method is to form a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a fancy word for your best guess. You want to come up with a reason. It could be the right one. It might not be the right one. You want to make a best guess on how to solve that problem. Okay? When you've done that, you have formed a hypothesis. What's the next part of the scientific method? We want to test your hypothesis through an experiment. This is where it gets a little tricky because for science, we want to make sure that your test, when you test your hypothesis, that you get certain types of data. We really want to deal with numbers in science, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So you're going to try to think of an experiment on a way to test whether your hypothesis is correct or not. The next part of the scientific method is to either accept or reject your hypothesis based off of the results of your experiment. Maybe you, through your testing, have figured out that your hypothesis was right all along. That's great. More often than not, though, what we'll find out is that your hypothesis might have been on the right track, but you didn't really nail it on your first attempt. Okay, it's fine to come back to these steps and form a different hypothesis and make a new experiment to figure this stuff out. The last part of the scientific method is to report your results or your conclusions. You want to put that information out there, either online, somewhere where other people can read it and look into it in a little bit more detail. Now, I've presented these 6 steps in order, but it's important to remember that when scientists do the scientific method, they kind of take a roundabout way. They don't always do these 6 steps in this exact order. It's okay to come back to something, redo a step. You're not always going to be able to do these 6 in this exact order, and that's okay. These are just 6 parts that you want to include when you are performing the scientific method. Okay? So, an important part of the scientific method is making observations. Observations is really just you collecting data. You're going to report how something looks or tastes, the colors, anything like that is making an observation. You're basically just looking at it. Okay, and there's 2 types of observations you can make using your senses. Your observations are either going to be objective or your observations might be subjective. And one of these are better than the other in a science class. And so I wanted to take a second and talk about the difference in between objective and subjective. Okay, here is a breakdown. So an objective observation is an observation based on fact. A fact is a piece of information that can be strictly defined and proved true. Okay? A subjective observation is an observation based on opinion. And an opinion is a statement that expresses a feeling, a value, or a belief. Okay, so they're not exactly the same thing. You can kind of think of this as like a fact or an opinion-based thing. Objective observations are based in fact, and subjective observations are based on opinion. I have a couple of examples I wanted to go over with y'all and see if y'all can pick out the difference in between them. So I'll put a statement up on the board. Y'all yell out whether you think it is an objective statement or a subjective statement, and make sure you say it nice and loud, and that way everybody in the class knows you've been paying attention and how smart you are. So let's go ahead and look into this. The first one says, science looks like fun today. Science looks like fun today. Is that an objective or a subjective statement? This one is a subjective statement. We can't really prove definitively or 100% if science is going to be fun. It's really just based on your opinion. Someone who really likes science, this might be a true fact. But if science is your least favorite class, this might not always be the case. Okay, the next example here is Kanye West's songs sound good. Is that an objective statement or a subjective statement? Well, not everybody likes Kanye West, so this is going to be a subjective statement. We really can't say if that's true for everybody. Okay, how about the next one here? The countertops in class are black. The countertops in the class are black. Is that objective or subjective? This one doesn't really care about your feelings about the countertops. Maybe you like them, maybe you don't like them because they're dirty, but either way, they are black, and so that is an objective statement. Here's the next one. School French fries taste good. Is that an objective or a subjective statement? Okay, well, this one is subjective because it's based on who is saying it. That's why it's called subjective. It comes down to the subject. If I like the school's French fries, then this is true for me. But if someone doesn't like French fries or they don't like the school cafeteria food, this isn't going to be true for them. Okay? How about the next one? The summer was too short. The summer was too short. Is that objective or subjective? Well, this one's actually going to be subjective. I know most of the students in here probably think that this is 100% true, but just, depends on who's saying it, right? This is more of an opinion. All right, how about the last one here? There are 60 seconds in a minute. That one is definitely an objective statement because we can prove it as either true or false beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay, so here's a couple of examples of objective versus subjective statements. Okay? Something else I wanted to talk about when it comes to objective or subjective is which one of these is going to be better to use in a scientific class or a scientific setting. Well, when you're doing an experiment, we really want to focus on objective observations. Those should be the ones that we use in science because they are based on facts, and the basis of science is to identify facts. So we're going to want to avoid subjective or opinion-like statements the best we can. Okay? Something else I wanted to talk about is something called an inference, okay? So what is an inference? An inference is an explanation that tries to make sense of your observations. So once you make these observations, you're going to start putting two and two together and see if you can figure out what's going on. That's an inference. Inferences are influenced by your experience and prior knowledge. And these explanations may or may not be true. So here's an example, and I want to see what y'all might think. Imagine you have a friend who's coming into class late, and he's breathing very heavily. That is an observation. You have noticed that John was breathing heavily as he walked into class. Well, that's going to get your mind turning, right? The wheels are going to start spinning. Why was he late? Why was he breathing heavily? Well, this is going to make you're going to make an inference based on that. One possible inference might be he ran to class because he was going to be late. If you're going to be late to class, you might start running to make sure you get there on time, and so maybe that's why he was breathing heavily. Okay, another option would be, number two, maybe he just played basketball in the gym, right? And this would be especially true if he came in with like a gym bag, right? So a kid walks into the classroom, he's breathing really heavily, he's got a gym bag on his shoulder. You would kind of put two and two together and make an inference to say he probably just got out of gym class. So an inference is kind of like an educated guess. Okay? So what would you infer? I'm going to put you don't have to answer these out loud. I'm going to put a question on the board, and I want you to think about what that would tell you. Okay? You're going to make some inferences based off of these different statements. So the first one. Everyone is closing their books because. Why would everyone be closing their books? Well, an inference that you might make here is maybe the class is about to end, right? When a class is about to end, everyone's going to start putting their stuff away. Another inference might be maybe the teacher told everyone to put their books away and you just didn't hear them, right? Those are two ideas that come to my mind if I saw everybody closing their book and I didn't know why. Here's another example. Many students buy French fries because. Why might people be buying French fries? We really don't know in this example, but a good guess would be they like to eat them. They taste good, right? That would be an educated inference to make. It may or may not be true, but with the facts that we have, that's just a really good guess. Here's another example. Students arrive to class sweaty because. Why might a student be arriving to class sweaty? Maybe they just got done with recess or gym or PE, right? And they were just getting hot and sweaty, and now that's why they're sweaty in class. Our last one, all of the students are laughing because. All of the students are laughing because. Maybe somebody told a joke that you didn't hear, right? Maybe the teacher did something funny when you weren't looking. That's where my mind goes. So when you see something that you can't explain, but you try to kind of fill in the blanks, that's called making an inference. And we use that in science sometimes, okay? Next thing I want to talk about is a hypothesis. What is a hypothesis? A hypothesis is a working explanation or trial answer to a problem. So once you've identified a problem and you've done some research, this is like the thing that you're going to test. And a hypothesis is an educated guess, okay? Often you'll see hypotheses written in an if-then because statement, and I'll give you an example of that at the end. But often when someone writes a hypothesis, you will see these three words. If, then they'll write something later, then, and then they'll end with something because, okay? So often when someone writes a hypothesis, you see these three words, if, then, because, okay? Something else about hypotheses is that it is not necessarily proven to be correct. Sometimes you make a hypothesis, you made your best guess, you did a test, you did an experiment, but the results of the experiment just didn't support the hypothesis that you made. That's okay. There's a really famous quote, I don't know if y'all know anything about Thomas Edison and him making the light bulb. So he's credited with making the light bulb, and he spent forever trying to make it. When someone asked him, hey, how do you feel about dedicating so much of your life to making this light bulb and so many of them didn't work? He said, oh, well, I didn't find how to make a light bulb. I found 99 ways not to make a light bulb. And that's okay. You're not always going to be right, but when you make a hypothesis and you prove it incorrect, you're still making progress. So just because you're not right all the time doesn't mean you're not smart. Smart people are wrong all the time. But that just is going to narrow down your focus and let you make a more accurate hypothesis next time. Okay, so what else do you need to know about hypotheses? Well, they're going to be repeated. You want to make a hypothesis and an experiment where it can be repeated by somebody else. If it's repeated multiple times and you're always getting the same results, that means that you're correct, and there's going to be a theory or a law based off of it. You'll see this when we do our lab next time. We're going to do several trials of our lab to make sure we're getting the right results. Okay, so I wanted to give you an example of a hypothesis. Remember how I said hypotheses often have the words if, then, because? Let's read this example and you'll kind of see what I mean. So this says, for a hypothesis, if an individual increases his or her activity level, then their heart rate will increase because the body's muscles will require more oxygen to function at a higher level. A faster beating heart will increase blood flow, thus allowing an increased concentration of oxygen to reach the cells in need. So we see those three words. If, then, because. This is a testable way to write that hypothesis. We're making claims that we can test. We're saying if somebody works out, their heart rate is going to elevate. I can think of a lot of different ways that we could prove that to be either false or correct based off the different kind of tests that we're going to do. But we're not quite there yet. Something else I needed to talk about when it comes to the scientific method and to doing experiments in science is this stuff called data. Okay, data are factual information. So these are facts, and there's two types of facts. You can have quantitative or you could have qualitative. They sound really similar, but they don't actually mean the same thing. I wanted to break it down for y'all real quick. Okay, so quantitative data is data consisting of numbers. So an example for this, based off of our previous example, would be your heart rate. That's like 80 beats in a minute. That's something that we can count, and it's dealing with a number, so we would say that it's quantitative. A different type of data is called qualitative. Qualitative data consists of verbal descriptions or information gathered using scales without numbers. So one way, an example of qualitative data might be the verbal description of the heart rate. So you could say that the heart rate was fast or slow, it was steady, or it was bounding. Okay? These words, they're easy to mix up because they sound so similar. So this is just what I tell people to remember. You've probably heard this saying before. You want quality over quantity. You want quality over quantity. And that's what these words are kind of coming from. So qualitative is you're describing it without numbers. So it's good, it's bad. And then quantitative is a number. So if you know what that saying means, I want quality over quantity. I want good results over just a lot. That'll help you remember the different types of data. Okay, now both of these are okay in science. Sometimes we do want both of them, but overall the quantitative data is better because if it's dealing with numbers, that's a lot easier to prove or disprove. If I'm talking about qualitative data, I might say something's good, but a scientist who's looking at the same results, doing the same test, maybe it doesn't meet their criteria for good, and they might say that it's bad. Quantitative, there's less of that gray area and less opinion involved in it. So overall, we want to use quantitative data that is based on numbers, because it's easier to prove or disprove. Okay? So something else when you're doing a lab or you're doing any type of trial in science is you want to have repeated trials. You want to do it more than once. Okay, experimental tests are usually done more than one time, and this is because it's necessary to provide more accurate results. Data is averaged together. So if you just do something one time, you might have found you want to do it multiple times. That's going to lead to better results. Okay? Here's an example that I wanted to talk about in the bottom there. So in the heart rates lab, each participant recorded their heart rates after performing various activities. Each participant's data for resting, walking, and running represents a trial. If 5 total individuals performed the activities and gathered data, then there were total of 5 trials. So it might be better, instead of just having one person do this lab about how exercise is affecting their heart rate, if we have 5 people do it instead of one, we're going to get better results because we might just have found like an outlier, something like a weird phenomenon. But if we do it over 5 people and then average all that data together, the data is going to be better overall. So you want to do stuff more than once when you're doing these kind of scientific labs. Okay, let's talk about variables real quick. There's 2 types of variables you really want to know about. What is a variable, first of all? Variables are things that can be assigned or take to different values in an experiment. Any factor that can change is a variable. And there's 2 types of variables that are very important when you're doing a lab. That's independent variables versus dependent variables. Let's talk about what those are. Okay, on the left, I have all the information about an independent variable. An independent variable is a variable that is purposely changed or manipulated in an experiment. Okay, sometimes it's even called the manipulated variable. Okay, the independent variable is the factor that you wish to test. It's why you're doing the test in the first place. Okay, the independent variable is usually expressed after the word if in the hypothesis. And lastly, the independent variable can be thought of as the cause in a cause and effect relationship. So let's go back to that example I gave you earlier about how exercising might be affecting your heart rate. In that example, the activity level, whether you're resting or walking or running, would be the independent variable because we're purposely wanting the test subjects to pick one of them to do to see how it's going to affect their heart rate. So that's the independent variable. Let's look at the dependent variable real quick. Okay, so the dependent variable, sometimes people call it the responding variable because it responds to the independent variable. The dependent variable are variables that may change as a result of the independent variable. We're not trying to purposely change them, they just kind of respond to what we did to the independent variable. Dependent variables, this is the factor that you measure to gather results. So when you're writing something down, you're getting your test results, that information that you're writing down is often the dependent variable. Okay, the dependent variable is usually expressed after the word then and the hypothesis, and this could be thought of as the effect in a cause and effect relationship. So going back to that example I gave you earlier, how does exercise affect your heart rate? The independent variable is what type of exercise we're having them do. Are we having them resting, walking, or running? The dependent variable is going to respond to that. Right? This would be the person's heart rate after they've done the exercise. So kind of think of it this way. If I'm walking, my heart rate isn't going to change as much. It's not going to go up as much as if I was running. So if I'm doing the walking or the running, that's the independent variable, but the results that I get out of it, how fast is my heart rate after I exercise, that's the dependent variable because it's responding to what we made the test subject do. Okay, these can be kind of confusing, so I have a couple of examples for us to look at, but just for your own, so you know, the independent variable is what the scientists change, and the dependent variable is how the test subject responds to it. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples and see if we can kind of narrow this down. So I'm going to put a sentence up here. I'll read it out to you. Remember those rules that I gave you, and I want to see if you can pick out the independent or the dependent variable. Here's the first one. If a student chooses to not study, then they will earn a poor grade. Okay, so here the student, what is the student choosing to do? They're choosing to do something. That's going to be our independent variable, and then the result of that choice is going to be the dependent variable. So are they choosing to not study, or are they choosing to have a poor grade? No one really wants to have a poor grade, but this student is choosing not to study. Maybe they have a baseball game or they're working, maybe they just don't feel like studying, but that is a choice that they made. So in this example, not studying is going to be the independent variable, okay? Now, what is responding to this? If you choose not to study, what result will that lead to? And this example is going to lead to having a poor grade. So earning a poor grade is the dependent variable, okay? Because it is responding to the independent variable. Okay, let's look at another one here. If you drink Gatorade before a soccer game, then you will score more goals. Okay, so you are choosing to do something here, and then it's having a result on the outcomes. Whatever you're choosing to do here is the independent variable, and whatever the result of that choice, that's going to be the dependent variable. So what's the independent variable here? It is the choice to drink Gatorade before the game. Maybe you like drinking Gatorade. Maybe you just drink water, okay? Regardless, that is a choice that you've made, okay? According to this sentence, and this would be a hypothesis, we could prove or disprove this. If you drink Gatorade, what is the result? Whatever the result is the dependent variable. This is saying if you drink Gatorade, then you're going to score more goals. So scoring more goals is the dependent variable. And notice how the dependent variable are things that we can measure in a quantitative way. A grade is a number. The number of scores you make is something you can count. Okay, so those are good dependent variables here. Here's one more. If you increase the mechanical advantage of a pulley system used to move an object, then the input force becomes less. Okay, so something is the cause and something is the effect. Okay, in this example, the independent variable is going to be the mechanical advantage of a pulley. You can increase it or decrease it. So you've made a choice on what to do to that pulley. What is the result of changing the mechanical advantage? It leads you to something. What does it lead to? It leads to the input force becoming less, right? So that is the amount of energy you have to put into it is the responding variable. It's the dependent variable, okay? Great job, y'all. Thanks for following along. We'll work with that plenty more, so just hang in there, okay? A couple more things I want to talk about. We're almost done here, so just hang in there with me. I want to talk about control or control groups. So when you're doing any type of scientific experiment, you want to have a control. A control is a group of subjects in an experiment that are not given any special treatment. It's kind of establishing our baseline. Okay, the control is something that is not manipulated. It's always just kind of stays the same in between every trial. Okay, and for the control, it's the same in every experiment group in every possible way, except for the factor being treated. Okay, the control group is a neutral point of reference for comparison. It allows you to see what changing a variable does by comparing it to not changing anything. Okay, and an example here would be, going back to that exercising example we've been talking about, the resting heart rate represented the baseline rate to which any increase in activity level was compared to. So like what this is saying is, you might want to know what my resting heart rate is before you have me exercise, because you don't really know if it's high or low for me, because you need to know what my baseline is. So a control or a control group is something that is not given that independent variable, and it just kind of stays the same in every group. Okay, last thing is a constant. Now, just like the name of this suggests, a constant is something that you're not going to change from one trial to the next. So this is a factor in an experiment, both in the experimental and control group, that are kept the same and not allowed to change. Here would be some examples. If we're doing that experiment about how exercise affects your heart rate, we always want to have these things constant. We would want 1 minute was consistently the amount of time allotted to perform the necessary activity. It would be hard to figure out how much exercise affected your heart rate if I'm working out for a minute and you have someone else working out for 5 minutes. You're going to get totally different results, so you want to make sure that every person is working out for the same amount of time. You would also want the type of activity performed, because you're going to get way different results if I'm walking and the other person is sprinting as fast as they can. That wouldn't really give you much to compare. It would be like comparing apples and oranges. If I walk for a minute and that person walks for a minute, the difference in between our results is going to be more helpful. You would want to make sure that the stopwatch used during data collection. You don't want someone counting down from 60, because you might count a lot faster than somebody else. So you would want it very consistent, okay? And then also constants. Another example for that would be the method used to measure the heart rate. Okay, y'all, I know I talked about a lot of stuff today, but your teacher has plenty of other practices for you to do. So just hang in there. You're going to get the hang of it. Make sure you give it your best effort, and I hope everybody has a great day.